Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tahrir Dialogue Series organized by the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. Today marks the 68th dialogue in our series that started way back in the year 2011. Our guest today for the event, Reflections on the Syrian Crisis, is Ambassador Ramzi Izzeddin Ramzi, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Syria. Ambassador Ramzi Izzeddin Ramzi's diplomatic career spans over 41 years with a primary focus on international security, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Prior to assuming his present position as UN Deputy Special Envoy for Syria in September 2014, he served in the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 38 years, which culminated in the position of Senior Undersecretary. Ramzi also served as Assistant Minister for International Economic Affairs, Deputy Assistant Minister for Disarmament and International Security, and Director for the United Nations Affairs. Abroad, he served as ambassador to Germany, Brazil, and Austria, as well as the Egyptian permanent representative to the UN and other international organizations. Ambassador Ramzi was also DCM at the Egyptian Embassy in Washington, D.C., political counselor in Moscow, and at the permanent mission to the UN in New York, and served for 1 year as the League of Arab States permanent observer to the UN and other international organizations in Vienna. He was educated at the American University in Cairo and Syrian University in the UK. Ambassador Ramzi, we are honored to have you with us today. Before we start our dialogue, I would like to welcome former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Dean of School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at AUC to give us his welcome notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and let me add my words of welcome to what she just said to all of you for being here. These dialogues are extremely important to us, and I think they've had a very important role in dealing with public issues with the wider community, with the wider community both in Egypt, and regionally. We make it a point to choose many different topics depending on what's of interest to the public. But one thing which we do not compromise on is always choosing speakers who have value added to the debate, or those who have experience that adds to the discussion, adds to the experience of our public, and also to the work of the university itself, both at the university and at the school. Ambassador Ramzi, Layla read through his bio, so I won't repeat that. Let me simply add that he's a friend of long standing. I won't say an old friend, because at our age we don't like to use the word old, but he's a friend of long standing. We've known each other even before our professional career started, and we actually started work at the Foreign Ministry at the same time. I want to add my words of welcome to Ramzi for being here. I appreciate very much, given the pressures on his schedule, that he would take time to join us in this university event. And I am very confident that what he will say will not be UNEs, but will be a straight, candid discussion of the situation in Syria and what we go on, and what will go on. I will, after he finishes, ask a few questions depending on the issues he raises, and then open to the floor to the audience to also engage in this, because it's an opportunity for all of you to ask him direct questions and to convey your thoughts. Two simple requests. One, please put your phones on silent or turn them off. And secondly, if you have questions or thoughts, put them in the form of short questions, because otherwise we won't have time to take enough requests from the floor, and that comes at the expense of others participating here with us. So once again, Ambassador Ramzi, thank you very much for being here, And you have the floor. You can speak either from here or from the podium, whatever you're comfortable with.
Thank you, Nabil. As Nabil said, we're old friends, and it gives me an added pleasure to be with him today in this forum. When Nabil asked me to speak and to reflect upon the situation in Syria, I thought to myself, at this point of time, the Tahrir dialogue could not be a better time or place. And I tell you why. Time, because we are short of the 7th anniversary of the unfolding of the Syrian tragedy, just a few days down next week. It will be 7 years. And also Tahrir dialogue. The word Tahrir, liberation, freedom, is a word with many meanings for this part of the world. And certainly this is how it started in Syria. It was a quest for liberty and freedom and human dignity. Of course, where we are now today is far from that. And I was thinking, how do I describe best the situation in Syria? I will borrow from a metaphor used by Winston Churchill to describe the Soviet Union. At the time, it was an enigma for everybody. Nobody really understood the Soviet Union. And Syria, to many of us, raises many questions. But let me try to, well, borrow from this metaphor. Well, it is I would say, a tragedy of dashed aspirations for human dignity, wrapped in mutually exclusive narratives, inside regional rivalries, and big power discord. You see how complicated the situation is in Syria? Unfortunately, it is probably the most complicated problem the United Nations, at least, has faced since the Second World War, since its inception. Now, where are we today in Syria? Well, unfortunately, there has been rather very disturbing, I would say, developments of late, both on the humanitarian side as well as on the political side. Now, I just want to put things into context so you understand where I'm coming from and where I would like us in the UN to proceed. On the humanitarian side, more than 400,000 probably dead, 5.5 million refugees. This is for a country that has received refugees with open arms. Since 1948, the Palestinians, the Lebanese in the 70s, and the Iraqis in the 80s. And now 5.5 million, sorry, I'm told it's, yeah, thank you. It's okay now? Okay, so 5.5 million refugees, around 7 million displaced. So all in all, half the Syrian population are not living in their homes. I don't think any country in the world has suffered such a fate. The GDP of Syria in 7 years has been halved. Life expectancy in 2010 was 70 years. In 2016, it's 55. 70% of the Syrian population now lives in poverty. And just two very important indicators for the future: health and education. Health, routine immunization, national immunization, dropped from 90%, one of the highest in the developing countries, in 2011. Today it's only 70%. Can you imagine what that means? And I think more importantly, 1.8 million children, Syrian children, are out of school, and 1.4 risk to be out of school if the situation continues in a year's time. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a country that was one of the top achievers of the Millennium Development Goals. In 7 years, a human catastrophe by any standard. Now, the military situation, just to put things into context. World War I, 40 countries were involved. World War II, 102 countries were involved. Some of them never fought, but declared that they were joining. In Syria today, you have 81 nationalities fighting on the territory of Syria, through regular armies or through proxies, through militias, you name it, they're all there. 81 nationalities fighting inside Syria. The war in Syria has outlasted World War II. And today, in the past few weeks, we have seen the de-escalation zones established by Astana process are under severe strain, and you can see that, you see it in the news every day, what's happening in eastern Ghouta, for example. You have Israeli attacks inside Syria, continuous. You have a Turkish incursion in Afrin, in the north. You have Turkish, Russian, and Israeli aircrafts being downed. You also have an alleged Iranian drone shot down. And also you had the incident east of the Euphrates where it appears there was a possible confrontation between Russia, the proxies of Russia, and the United States. This is where things are right now. And I think the Secretary General probably summed it up when he described these developments as fault lines in Syria. And if they intersect, which is likely, if they intersect, the situation in Syria will be even more tragic than it is right now. So, how do we try to summarize this situation? I can see two scenarios in Syria, both very dangerous and not mutually exclusive. One, there is a possibility, although I would like to believe that nobody has an interest in that scenario unfolding, but there is a possible scenario which basically is a regional conflagration. It is very possible. And move away from proxy conflict into direct conflict between both regional and international powers. The other scenario, which is a perpetuation of the zones of influence. If you look at the Syrian map today, yes, there are zones of influence. Let's not, we cannot overlook that. They exist. East of the Euphrates, in the south, in the north, there are these zones of influence. Now, if these zones of influence continue, it has very negative consequences for the future of Syria. They are not sustainable, and they will lead to a even more dangerous situation down the road. So you have these two scenarios, which a lot of people look at and say, it is possible. And I'd like to say something. In Syria, we always look at things, and I've been in this job for almost 3.5 years, and it's been an emotional roller coaster. Every time you think you're about to turn the corner, some event happens, unexpected event, and it is usually a very bad one, and it brings us back almost to square one. I hope we're not there. So given these two likely scenarios, and something needs to be done to prevent them from unfolding. And you had an attempt by the Security Council in just a few days ago in adopting Resolution 2401. This is an attempt, it was by 15 votes, an attempt to address the situation. Of course, we still see that there's a problem in its implementation. And it gives also renewed impetus to the Special Envoy and his team to keep the political process alive. I mean, that is the hope. In spite of all these negative developments on the ground, both and in Syria, regionally and internationally, I think it is important that the UN does not give up on its pursuit of a settlement, and that I think this is what we're trying to do now. Now, how did we reach this point? How did we reach this point over 7 years? And that's a very personal opinion. I think, like I said earlier, it was the dashed aspirations for dignity that became entangled in a lot of regional and international developments. But I think the problem started very early on when the United States and Russia both dealt with the Syrian problem at an arm's length. The United States looked at Syria. It was never a part of its zone of influence. It was never a national priority, and thought that it could, through its allies in the region, handle the situation. And at the time, as you know, with the Arab Spring, the expectation was the government in Damascus would not last. And therefore, there was no reason, no justification, no interest for the United States to have a direct intervention, and allowed its allies to, and by the way, who had different agendas and competing agendas. The Russians, on the other hand, had always a very close relationship with Damascus. So they really understood the nature of the state, the nature of the regime, and understood that it was extremely resilient, contrary to what the other side thought. So I think they decided to do two things: give it diplomatic cover and give it military assistance, and retain the option of
a military intervention if need be, which is what happened later on. So, given that situation,
the regional countries intervened one way or another for a variety of reasons inside Syria, and the rest is history. Now, I know there's a legitimate question, and I'm sure I will be asked that question because I'm asked that question everywhere, regardless of the location. So given this complicated situation, what has the UN done? Well, the UN role is really twofold. There is a humanitarian role and there is a political role. On the humanitarian side, in spite of enormous difficulties that relate to the safety and the security situation on the ground, and therefore the safety of UN personnel, and a lot of very, very cumbersome bureaucratic procedures. You know, for the UN to deliver across Syria, it requires permissions from the government, and that has been rather difficult. But in spite of that, we have been, over the past 7 years, provided medical aid and food assistance and other assistance to almost 13 million Syrians in need, including in hard-to-reach and besieged areas. And believe me, without this UN assistance, the tragedy that you are witnessing here today, and which is abhorrent to everybody, would have been much, much, much more than what you see. So that is on the humanitarian side. In spite of everything, we have people on the ground. We work with Syrians and others to provide aid, whether it is cross-border in areas where it is not accessible from inside Syria, whether from Jordan or from Turkey, but also cross-line from government-controlled areas into areas that are not controlled by the government, that have, of course, receded tremendously over the past year. Now, on the political side, I'll try to explain it in as simple terms as possible. I would look at the UN role there in two stages. Stage one, from 2012 to 2014, where you had the former Secretary General Kofi Annan as the special envoy, and then Al-Akhdar al-Ibrahimi. Under Kofi Annan, the Geneva Communique was adopted, which laid the foundations for a settlement. But Syrians will tell you, we were not even involved in that. These were regional countries, international players who came together and agreed amongst themselves on what they thought were the foundations for a peaceful settlement. At the time, of course, the context I have to emphasize was that the government in Syria would not last very long. Then came Al-Akhdar Ibrahimi, and his efforts culminated in the Geneva II conference in the beginning of 2014, which was a way to implement the Geneva communique. And we know what happened. But what is important there, he was able to bring the Syrian parties, the government and the opposition, together around the same table. No result, but this is the important development there. Now, stage two in which I am involved, and I started with the appointment of Staffan de Mistura, the special envoy, and I started working with him on the same day. Now, stage one, you can call it top-to-bottom approach. What we have tried to do is actually add a different track. Top to bottom continued, and I'll explain what happened, but we also included another track which is basically bottom to top, which in many ways sets a precedent for UN mediation efforts. Because we have decided that, okay, we need to work with regional parties, international parties, but we have to work with Syrians. And we have to work with Syrians at the grassroots level. And we have to hear from them what they want, what kind of a future they see for their country. And in the process, I think we have succeeded. I know there's a lot of criticism. To keep Syria on the international radar, to keep the political process going, and therefore hope in spite of everything. Now, let me explain what happened on the bottom to top. On the bottom to top approach, we had a series of meetings. We reached out to more than 100 Syrian important individuals and organizations. We discussed with them their vision of the future of Syria. That took place a year and a half ago, and did produce for us insights into what Syria, what the Syrians really want. We have also established a civil society support room, which is still active today and has been for the past year, and meets every time we have a round of negotiations between the government and the opposition. And this includes, so far, because the people who participate have changed over time, we have engaged almost 200 people in this process. And then we have, of course, the Women Advisory Board, which, of course, is a very important thing, gives us an important insight into what half of the population wants, how they see the situation, how they can help us. So that has been one approach, which is bottom to top. Now, going back to the top to bottom, which is a continuation really of what happened under Ibrahimi and Kofi Annan. We've maintained continuous engagement with the government of Syria, with the Syrian opposition, with regional parties, and also interested international parties. This resulted, I would say, in a number of important developments. But most importantly, I think, due to these efforts, the International Syria Support Group was established under the co-chairmanship of the Russian Federation and the United States. And what is important here is, when this group was established, it was very clear that there were two aspects to the problem. One was the military situation, and one was the political. The military situation required a ceasefire, and the ceasefire was a responsibility of interested parties, not the United Nations. Interested parties who have an influence on the players on the ground had a role to play. So they had to deliver that. And the United States and Russia worked for that for a while. It did not ultimately succeed. And then we have, I would say, the development was really the Astana process, which I will refer to later. On the political side, it resulted in Security Council Resolution 2254. Security Council Resolution 2254 is really a way to operationalize the Geneva Communique. And it laid out a map, a roadmap, for how to achieve that. And it had a number of principles which ultimately were reflected in the agenda of the Geneva talks, and they as 4 baskets. Now, the first one had to do with governance. You needed a new governance in Syria, of course, to be determined through negotiation. Second, you needed a new constitution. Third, you needed elections under UN supervision. And fourth, you needed to combat terrorism and also have concept-building measures. These were the 4, I would say, milestones on the roadmap to a political settlement in Syria. During these talks, and we've held 10 rounds, yes, very little progress, true, but there are many reasons to explain that. But I think one of the more important things that resulted from these 10 rounds was we were able at the UN to distill what we heard from all the Syrian parties in 12 principles. 12 principles that would govern the future of Syria. And we were very gratified then when the Syrian National Dialogue took place in Sochi, these principles were adopted word for word. So now 1,500 Syrians met and decided that these principles should govern the future of Syria. In our view, should also govern the whole negotiation process. Now, meanwhile, on the political side, a number of developments, a number of initiatives took place. You had the Astana process, which included, of course, the Russian Federation, Iran, and Turkey, and its primary focus was de-escalation. To deal with the military situation, resulted in the establishment of 4 de-escalation zones. As I said, they are under pressure now, especially Eastern Ghouta, but they did result in overall de-escalation of violence in Syria. But now there is pressure, no doubt, and we have to deal with that. So that was the Astana process with 3, I would say, co-guarantors, and it was a very useful, very important contribution to the UN. The second initiative was an initiative primarily by the Russian Federation, but also supported by Iran and Turkey, which is the Syrian National Congress, which took place in Sochi a month ago. This produced 2 important results. One, as I said, confirmed the 12 principles that the UN worked for almost a year, but also called for the establishment of a constitutional committee as a way to jumpstart the political process, and gave the special envoy the responsibility to establish this committee, set its terms of reference, select its participants, of course in consultation with the interested parties. So this is the second important development that has taken place, or initiative. And then third, we see the United States has re-engaged, I would say, in the political process for a very long period of time. I think the United States was more interested in the military dimension of the conflict in Syria. It has established a small group of countries, permanent members of the Security Council, France and the UK, but also some regional countries such as Saudi Arabia and Jordan. And this in itself is an important development because it reflects an interest on the part of the United States to engage on the political process. Now, I'm always asked, but don't you think Astana, Sochi, this and that, all undermine the role of the UN or dilute it? No, it has been proven that Astana has been helping the UN. Sochi, the outcome now has come back to the UN. So we see all of these initiatives, we welcome them, and we see them as a contribution to our effort. Now, the way ahead, I think two things are necessary. One, de-escalation of violence, and that is why we need to do something about Eastern Ghouta as soon as possible, as well as Afrin, no doubt, in the north. And on the political process, which is basically the Geneva process, we have to work on two levels. One is to establish the Constitutional Committee, which we find to be probably, in the circumstances, the best way to move ahead. It allows Syrians to design their own future. And it's going to be inclusive. This is what Sochi required of us, not just government and opposition, but also civil society in its general sense would be involved, and we're finding mechanisms for that. And then we will continue our rounds, which will deal with the three other baskets, which is the issue of governance, the issue of elections, and the issue of combating terrorism and building. And all of that is important. These baskets are important because for the Constitutional Committee to be effective, to move ahead, it has to operate in a climate or an environment of a safe and neutral environment. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for the Syrians to come together and agree on how to design their future through the vehicle of a constitution. Now, having said all of that, the Syrians are going to decide their future, and that has been the position of the UN all along. The UN is only there to help them, to create an environment that would enable them to decide their own future in a way that they feel comfortable with. We are not imposing anything, but we have tried everything. We have tried, like I said, top to bottom, bottom to top. We improvise all the time to keep the process going, to give the Syrians a chance to decide their future in the appropriate circumstances. Now, Syria is a tragic situation. I don't think anyone can afford Syria to get any worse. Syria will not implode, it will explode, and the region will suffer. So I think everybody has an interest to very quickly address the situation and try to create the conditions that would allow the Syrians to decide their own future. Thank you very much, Nabil.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much for that. It was a very useful presentation. I'm going to open the floor for the audience, but let me ask a couple of questions to start off with. At the very beginning, when you basically outlined the options that may, or the alternatives that may occur, you did mention that a solution was not, or that even part of the vision for the future, two visions appears to be that worse rather than a possible solution. I remember back in 2014, which you mentioned correctly, the conference we held just outside of Geneva, where for the first time the Syrian government and the opposition were present. It wasn't a particularly productive conference, but it was the first time that everybody was there. With the Azerbaijani process, the social process, and what we're talking about in Geneva, my recollection is that when Geneva first started, before we got into the Azerbaijani constitution, in other words, before things got worse, among the main problems were a lack of agreement between Syrian, and here I'm talking about the Syrian agreement, not regional agreement, and there are many. The main problems were on the issue of elections and on the issue of terrorism. Who was what, to put it that way, and when the elections would be held and who would be allowed to run and not allowed to run. You seem to be changing the order of the discussion. And I don't mean you personally, or the country that I want to commend you both for your efforts. But by postponing the difficult questions to the end, do you really think that's an easier way to achieve the answer to those questions? Or is it simply a postponement of the process and then you will relive
what we've been reliving with the Palestinians and Israelis? When they put off the difficult questions to the end, and when they started to address them, be that the actual territory or Jerusalem, the whole thing broke down. So my question to you really is, do you see a serious political process where there can be openings towards resolving this? I completely agree with you. It has to be resolved by the Syrians themselves. But is it possible for them to do it themselves without the international and regional players, all of whom are active on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Let me put it this way. My job as a mediator is, against all odds, is to discern, identify the silver lining in a very gloomy situation and build on it and convince the various parties that it is more in their interest to cooperate and to try to solve the problem. So I always try not to be overly optimistic because I think it's dangerous, but I think as a mediator, you have no choice but to look at the brighter side, even if it is very, very small, and expand. Now, let me try to address the points you made, which are extremely valid. Now, the order of things. The UN has tried different, I would say, approaches. And it has always improvised, always tried to be imaginative. For a very long period of time, things were stuck on the issue of governance. And there was no traction on that, so we decided that we should actually move on 4 different parallel tracks. One is governance, the other is elections, constitution, and combating terrorism. Now, if you cannot move on governance, I think you either do elections or you do constitution. It seems to us, after consulting, and that has been reflected actually in various, I would say, international fora. It was agreed between the Russian Federation and the United States in their statement in Da Nang a few months ago that priority should be given to a constitutional reform as a way to further the political process. Some have argued, well, let's go for elections first and everything else will fall into line. I think there are different approaches, but at this point of time, I think what we have, after trying different ones, we have tried the issue of the Constitution. Now, when you say postponing the difficult questions. Well, in such a complicated situation, where there are not only internal parties, but regional and international parties, I think it's always useful to start without too much ambition. Start where things can get traction, and then move in concentric circles beyond. That's why elections, governance is very difficult because governance, there are 2 different scenarios or 2 different narratives. The government says, well, everything is fine, we won't change anything. The opposition says nothing will change until the government is changed. So you need to break that logjam. So one way of doing it, in our view, is get Syrians to discuss their constitution. Of course, it's still not easy, and we're still facing problems, and we will continue to face problems. So I think the best way is to start on small things and move ahead. You refer to the Palestinian question. I hope Syria is not another problem that the region will face for decades, Well, I'm sure we'll not be around for that, and that's why it's important to move as soon as possible. Now, when I gave you what seemed to be a rather bleak picture, I gave it to you because there is it is realistic, but it is not it should not necessarily happen if the international community, the UN, does its best to stop these scenarios from unfolding. And there are some indications that it is possible. But it gives us, I think, motivation to redouble our efforts to find a path, difficult as it is, to break this logjam. Otherwise, this situation can continue. And as I said, merely the perpetuation of the zones of influence in Syria is not sustainable. It'll blow up in our face down the road. Thank you.
One last question on my behalf.
A lot of questions.
Well, since I have some in writing now, you might as well send them up.
Too many.
Again, let me push you a little bit, and I appreciate the situation that you're in, serving the UN. I don't think that there can be a sustained political process that seriously opens the door for resolving this conflict that does not end with the Syrians themselves deciding on what they want and what they don't want, but that does not begin with the major players who are not Syrian at least reaching an understanding, I don't want to say an agreement, an understanding of where the fault lines, as you mentioned, or where the red lines are, how far they can cooperate with each other to not face the worst case scenario which you mentioned, which is a direct conflict between regional players or international players. Is there really, in the near future, any possibility for a dialogue among the major powers on a serious dialogue? Not, I know they're talking about some military measures on the ground on the de-escalation issues and so on, but is there any real room for a serious strategic dialogue between the two major powers? And I would add to that, between the regional players as well. I noticed that in following the process as a whole, and even in what you said, very little reference was made to actually the Arab countries. And I am a bit concerned that there seems to be more of a focus on Turkey and Iran, and then on Israel, than there is to Arab concerns. My concern is the Syrian concern. But ultimately, to get there, we need to have both a strategic understanding and a regional understanding.
Nabil, you always raise very interesting points that require a lot of thought, I think, to respond to. Now, first, is there any prospect of, I guess, what you would like to refer to as a dialogue between the Russian Federation and the United States? They have been talking. There have been ups and downs. I think during the Obama administration, there was traction. I think there could have been much more progress than actually happened, but that's a different story, and I think history will tell us what went wrong. But I think there was a serious attempt to get things moving. Now with the change in administration in the United States, you know that the U.S. position vis-a-vis Russia is complicated, to say the least. There has been an interest on the part of the administration to engage Russia, but for a variety of reasons, mostly for domestic reasons, it has been complicated for them to engage in serious dialogue. But on Syria, they continue to talk. I can tell you that. On Syria, they continue to talk. They have reached deconfliction arrangements, but I think there is more to it than that. Now, would it be possible for then to elevate this dialogue to a strategic one, I think this is really something for them to decide. Internal dynamics in the United States have complicated it, no doubt. And on the Russian side, there is an election in 10 days. I think these are two elements that you have to take into account. But my sense, talking to both parties, I think they understand that they can reach an understanding on Syria. That is my view. Regardless of where their differences are, but on Syria, I think it is not impossible, and I hope that happens. On the region, yes, you raised the point that many, especially Arabs, reach. Where are the Arabs in all of this? Turkey has a direct role, Iran has a direct role, and therefore influence on the ground and in the political process. Arab countries have engaged indirectly or politically not at all. And I think this is an issue that probably does need to be addressed. In the small group, you have, of course, Jordan. You have Jordan also involved in the de-escalation zone in the south. In the de-escalation zone around Damascus, eastern Ghouta, Egypt was involved and I believe continues to be involved. So there is an Arab, I would say, role, but it's certainly not where it needs to be. If you're going to talk about the future of Syria, I don't see how you can reach a sustainable settlement without an Arab dimension. I don't see that happening, but it's really up to the Arab countries to take steps, put themselves in a position to play a constructive role in this settlement. Now, clearly things would be much easier if the Arabs, Turkey, and Iran are able to engage in a strategic dialogue or a dialogue on regional security. I think a lot of people have been asking for that, but it has not happened for a variety of reasons. But I think that certainly would be an important contribution to creating, I would say, an even playing field inside Syria that would allow for a settlement that would take into account Arab interests. So yes, that is very important, and I think the regional dimension is important. Now, if you discuss, I mean, Turkey at this point, I think the situation or its policy has changed over the past 7 years, and its priority today, of course, is dealing with the Kurdish issue and securing its southern border. That's an important shift, and I look at it from a more positive angle in terms of its engagement in Syria on the political side. Iran is a country that has influence inside Syria and has produced actually a plan years ago, I mean 6 years ago, the 4-point plan, which has elements which we have adopted, elections, new constitution, and so forth. So Iran is also engaged. The Arab League, unfortunately, is not a player in its entirety, but individual Arab countries do play a role, whether it's Iraq or Jordan or for that matter Egypt. But yes, the regional context is necessary, and it is the regional and international context that will provide the enabling environment for the Syrians to decide on their future. Without that, I find it very difficult for the Syrians actually to be able to agree upon themselves.
Thank you, Ramzi. As you can see, there are many questions, and as you would expect, they come from different sides, different opinions. I'm going to just take the headlines of the questions for two reasons: to save time, but also because I can't read the handwriting. So it's difficult to get into the exact language that's used here. The first set of questions or reflections is a sense that the UN has not dealt with the Syrian government properly, and that it seems to take it for granted in its actions, specifically with respect to the Constitution, among other things. The opposite opinion is also expressed in this second set of questions, where the UN is being accused of allowing the Syrian government to drag its feet and change the situation on the ground at the expense of everyone who's suffering, be that refugees or civilians, and so on and so forth. So again, an opinion on that is expressed, and you can choose to comment on either of them or not to do that. The third question, which I think you alluded to a little bit, but a third point and a third question is there a way for the UN to address the Syrian people directly rather than through government systems or opposition groups? I think your reference to civil society in a way raised that point and indicated that you were trying to do that. That comes, of course, with the sense that there's a major conspiracy happening in the region, be that a conspiracy for or against Syria. They're both reflected in the questions here. A more precise question relates to what is the UN doing in tangible terms on a humanitarian basis with the present situation in Eastern Ghouta? Have you been able to open corridors for civilian access and humanitarian support systems? One last question, and I'll allow you to answer those I've mentioned, and then we can take a second round, is controversial, and that's why I'll give you a chance to take your breath after that. Who's going to be held responsible for all the atrocities that have occurred if and when this problem is solved? And I'll allow you to sort of reflect on those questions first and then move on. Again, these are questions from the floor, not mine.
Well, with a friend like you, Nabil, so it's very clear. Well, yes, dealing with the Syrian government, it's basically, and that's the question we get all the time. Now, damn it if you do, damn it if you don't. Frankly, it boils down to that. We have never ignored the Syrian government. Personally, I have been to Damascus many, many times. The last time was in January. We consult continuously with them. We put them in the picture as to how we will like to proceed. We take their views on board, and we have, just to give you an example, and that's how the mediator operates. The 12 principles that I have discussed, that I have told you about, the 12 principles that, in our view, and now it's apparently for many Syrians, can govern the future of Syria, are an attempt by the Office of the Special Envoy to deal with a set of principles the government provided for us. But in their view, there were a set of principles that would govern the political process. Now, of course, it would be very difficult for these principles to be accepted by the opposition, so we discussed with the government and the opposition, and ultimately we thought that these principles better be not about the actual political process, but about the future of Syria, and therefore govern the political process. So, no, we have been in discussion, in continuous consultation with the government. Now, yes, true, on the Constitutional Committee, yes, there is a problem. There is a problem in the sense that the Sochi final declaration, and by the way, this is now an official document of the Security Council, does give the UN the responsibility to set up this committee. The Syrian government disputes that, says no, this is not what happened in Sochi. Now we go by the official document of the Security Council, and we are prepared to discuss this different difference in opinion or positions and find a way to move ahead. But I mean, we have been given a responsibility and we intend to discharge it. But we understand we cannot proceed without all Syrians on board, including, of course, the government. Now, yes, on the other side, people have said that this political process, all these rounds, have allowed the government to pursue its policy and create facts on the ground. But let me tell you what is the alternative. Without a political process, which would allow also humanitarian aid to go in, how would the situation be like? I think the UN would not be there, the international community would not be interested in what's happening in Syria, and the situation would continue unabated on the ground without any prospect of reaching a political settlement, albeit an imposed political settlement that, in our view and in view of many others, is not sustainable, is really not sustainable. I think you referred also to the fact that the Syrians, is there a way to talk directly to the Syrians? And I think I did answer that question. Since Staffan de Mistura, the present envoy, assumed his responsibility, we have tried, in addition to the top to bottom, bottom to top, we have engaged civil society through different mechanisms, and we have heard what the Syrian people want to tell us. And whether it is through the mechanism of the civil society support room, or through the Women Advisory Board, or through the Geneva consultations, we have talked to hundreds and hundreds of Syrians in Geneva and in the region. So I think we are in a much better position than any of the other mediators to really get the pulse of the Syrians, both inside and outside Syria. So I think that we have been able to do. Nabil, when we talk about conspiracies and so forth, I think what I said earlier when I tried to describe Syria as being, dashed aspirations for human dignity wrapped in mutually exclusive narratives, I was alluding to that. There's a government scenario which basically says this is all a conspiracy, and then there's another narrative which is, no, this is about freedom, liberation, and human dignity. And so there are these narratives, unfortunately, and that's what complicates the situation. Now, on Eastern Ghouta, yes, you see these images every day, and they are abhorrent. What I can tell you is that we've been working for the past 2 weeks to provide humanitarian assistance in Eastern Ghouta, whether it's medical or food. And hopefully tomorrow, if not the day after, there will be, I hope, no surprises, a convoy that will enter Eastern Ghouta. Of course, Eastern Ghouta are 400,000 inhabitants. This convoy will only provide, I think, for less than 30,000, but at least it's a first step. But you have to understand that there are safety and security issues involved. We have to be very careful. People put their lives online, and we need to make sure that these people are safe and secure so that they can provide the humanitarian aid. We need to do a lot more, but it has been very difficult. But I think that is important. Now, of course, on the issue of accountability, all these atrocities that have been committed in Syria on all sides, and I'm not going to say who more than who, but they have been. The issue of accountability is there, and I don't see it going away, and it will have to be part of the ultimate package in Syria. I don't think it is good for Syria, for the future of Syria, to allow those who have committed crimes against humanity, to go scot-free. But they will have to be dealt with within a political context that would allow the political process now to continue and reach its ultimate destination, which is a settlement. Otherwise, I think we will add complications to this process. But accountability, no doubt, is there and will have to be applicable, but it will have to be part of a political package at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. Again, I'll give you the sense of the questions that have come up. First, once again, the whole issue of are the main players, regionally and internationally, ready to engage, or do you sense any readiness? But the focus here was not on the two major powers, but actually the regional players. Are they tired enough, or have they achieved enough to start engaging in a dialogue that would ultimately open the door, or could open the door, for more concrete, serious negotiations? That's one set of questions. Then you have, again, the two opposing sentiments. One is that this cannot be solved with the present Syrian regime, and the other is it cannot be solved if you ignore the present Syrian regime. But I repeat it because you need to get a sense of what the audience is feeling. I would add to that, again, another question which comes after commendation of Stefan's role and your role in particular, but there's a question mark about, does the present ceasefire actually serve only one side? In this case, the reference is the Syrian government, rather than the balance on the ground. It comes in less than diplomatic terms, the question does at least. So let me just sort of put it that way rather than the way it was drafted. The last question I'd add here, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor for those who may want to ask questions directly. Has there been any attempt to try to convert some of the resources that exist in Syria after the defeat of ISIS? And the reference here is to oil and gas. I think it's a bit premature, but outside the areas where there is a direct conflict, has the humanitarian situation for Syrians gotten any better after ISIS than it was before? Oh, and Ramzi, if I may add, one question which comes up this time is, from your political analysis, rather than your role as a moderator trying to achieve a solution to this and an envoy from the UN, how much of the problem that you see in Syria is sectarian and how much of it is geopolitics?
On the regional situation, if you compare the situation, I would say, in 2017 to the situation 2016 or before, in spite of the recent developments, which I find very disturbing, but they may not represent a trend, but we have to be aware that if left unchecked, yes, they will. But I think the situation is more conducive, I think, to regional understandings, and let me tell you why. The priorities have shifted amongst the regional players. As I said, Turkey's priority now is to deal with this, to secure its southern border, which means the Kurdish problem. The regime change for Turkey does not seem to be the priority at this stage. So I think there is an important shift in that position. Saudi Arabia, another important player inside Syria, you can detect that Syria is no longer a top priority. It has other issues that command its attention, and the situation in Syria for it is one, I think, that they're and have shown a desire to play a constructive role to bring it to an end. So that's another important player that I would say its position has developed in a positive way. If you look at Iran, again an important player inside Syria, Iran's position has been consistent since the very beginning, but now it is working with Turkey and Russia in Astana, and it is also a sponsor of the Sochi process. So I think now Iran has moved in a different situation insofar as the political process is concerned. I cannot speak for the Iranian position, but they have always said that there can only be a political settlement. I think they've said that very clearly. Some would argue, well, on the situation on the ground it looks different, but in our discussions with them, it was always on the political process and a political settlement. So, in terms of the region, I think if we put aside the possibility of a conflagration that would involve Israel and Iran, and I think this has receded somewhat, I think that the situation is, I think, a little bit better in general terms than it was a year ago. Now, when the situation started in Syria, the expectation was the government in Syria would collapse in a few months. It's been 7 years. It has not collapsed. It has proved to be resilient, and I think people have come to understand that that dealing with the government is necessary, but dealing with it within the context of an internationally sanctioned political process is an important requirement. So we have to engage the government. There are many countries who have difficulties, who do not want to formally lend their formal recognition, but they deal with the government indirectly in many ways. So I think the government is there, and it is the international community's, I think, interest to engage it and to move it towards a reform as Security Council Resolution 2254 has. But you cannot wish it away. It's been 7 years, but you have to deal with it. Now, the present ceasefire, does it help the government? Well, I like to look at it, it helps the Syrian people. I mean, in 7 years, there has been so much suffering, so many displaced, so many refugees, so many deaths. Can this continue for another 7 years? I don't think so. So I think whatever is done to de-escalate violence, but it has to be coupled with a political process. You cannot have a sustained de-escalation without a political process, and this is where the UN comes in. Both have to come hand in hand, and that is what I was trying to caution. If people think there is a military solution, I think it's a pipe dream. It's over. There is no military solution. You can win a battle, but you cannot win the war. The war is on the negotiating table where all Syrians can decide their future, and this is what we're trying to do. So there is no military solution as such, but you can win a battle, but certainly not the war. Has the situation improved in the area where Daesh, ISIS, has been defeated and left? Now, as you know, ISIS today is in very few pockets around Syria. There's a very small pocket on the Golan, very, very small pocket, the Yarmouk Valley. There is a very small pocket in Damascus, in the Yarmouk camp, Palestinian camp, and they are south of Aleppo, another very small pocket, and their bigger presence is closer to Iraq, east of the Euphrates, in two areas, one immediately on the border with Iraq and another on the Euphrates, small areas. The rest where they have left, by and large, yes, the situation has improved, no doubt, but not to the extent that we would like. But yes, it has improved, but not in the areas in which they continue to operate, but in very small, isolated pockets, but dangerous still. Because here again, if there is no political process, you run the risk of ISIS regenerating itself in different forms and coming back again. Maybe not operating the way it did before, where it had control over a vast area, but it can operate in much smaller groups around Syria. Now, I think oil and gas, I think it's, as you said, Nabil, it's premature. As you know, the majority of the oil and gas in Syria is east of the Euphrates. This is an area where the Syrian defense forces, democratic forces, control. There are skirmishes here and there with Daesh, but also, as you saw a few weeks ago, between militias and apparently some Russians and the United States. So no, this is an area where I think it's too early to tell what's going to happen. Your last question was, what is driving the conflict in Syria, sectarianism or geopolitics? I think it is more geopolitics. There is, unfortunately, an element of sectarianism in Syria which did not exist before, and has been a result of geopolitics. And every Syrian I have met is abhorrent of secularism, or calling the conflict in Syria as a sectarian conflict. Of course, there are radical elements that would like to push the sectarian narrative, but the vast majority of Syrians find it abhorrent to call their conflict as a sectarian one.
Thank you, Ramzi. Those have been very useful answers. We'll take one round from the floor because we promised to finish by 7:30. Mohammed, you wanted to? Fadl.
Let me first thank Ambassador Ramzi for giving us his time, and I do hope that he makes this a rule for the future visits. Sorry? This is Mohammed Anis Salim, retired diplomat, and the last UNICEF representative to Damascus before things went south. So I'm, of course, distressed by your portrayal of the situation there. When I left, things were very good. But I want to say that one of the mistakes made was in the UN perception of Syria at that time as a country in transition, CIT, a country where the UN would phase out its assistance because they were doing well in their health and education systems. So there were issues of preventive diplomacy, which our present Secretary General is very interested in. But I have two questions really on process. One is when I look at the multitude of UN mediation missions in the region and all the conflicts, where you have special envoys, special representatives of the Secretary General, none of them is actually looking very promising. The track record doesn't look very good. The prognosis for the future doesn't look very good. Is this model where the Secretary General holds back and fields special representatives to do the day-to-day work, is this model working? Or should we go back to something we had in the 50s and 60s, where the Secretary General himself, or perhaps one day herself, should be the person to get engaged? I don't feel that this model is working very well. The second question is, you mentioned that there are 81 nationalities fighting in Syria. Sometimes I feel there are 81 peace initiatives handled by different parties. So you have Sushi going on, you have Isitana going on, you have the Friends of Syria going on, you have your process in Geneva, and there is no central control of this process. And if any, it seems to be taking away from the central role of the UN system as the key mediators. Are you happy with this? Are you happy to see everybody even the Riyadh, Cairo platforms, Ankara, inviting the opposition while you were trying to do that at a separate stage. Isn't it very difficult to mediate in an environment where everybody else is also mediating? Thank you.
Any other questions?
أنا سامح مكرم عبيد. I'm a former member of parliament and a good friend to both Ramzi and Nabil. And I usually have a problem with listening to one diplomat. Now I'm listening to two diplomats. So really, I'm trying to figure out what in God's name are you really saying? And I've been trying to decide, maybe we need Anis Abed to translate what you're really telling us. In my personal or professional life, I work as a mediator between companies, between people in conflict. And my first question is always, حق ربنا فين؟ فين حق ربنا في القصة دي كلها? Where is it? And in all that presentation, I could not figure out حق ربنا فين. Where did it go wrong? How did we reach that? And you can, Ramzi, with all honesty, with the UN, you can mediate for another 100 years. There will be 100 million Syrians that are dying. The whole conflict will not go on. We are obviously at a standstill. It is a standstill. And nothing is going to move until the regional powers, Iran, Turkey, namely Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt, and the two superpowers, they sit down on the bloody table and they reach a solution. If you go to the Syrian people, mafish Syrian people, they're gone. They're all over the place. Who are we asking for them, whether it's politics before, or constitution before? There's no Syrian. These regional players, they have to sit down and find a solution and get the misery over with. But we can't go on into diplomacy. Well, like the ambassador was saying, it's not going to go on. This misery is not going to, we're not going to see the end of it. Thank you.
مساء الخير. بس بدي اسال سؤال بالعربي. انا اسمي ياسر مسامي وانا ناشط وباحث سياسي سوري. في البدايه المقاربه اللي تفضلت فيها حضرتك عن موضوع المقاربه اللي من القاعده للقمه. عفوا، من القاعده للقمه. حضرتك ذكرت هذه المقاربه وذكرت انجازات المبعوث الدولي واللجنه الدوليه في هذا الموضوع، ولكن نحن كسوريين لاحظنا انه هذا الامر مرتبط فقط في المعارضه. انتم هذه المقاربه قمتم فيها فقط من طرف المعارضه، يعني انتم حاولتم تكوين معارضات، حاولتم تكوين مجتمع مدني من المعارضة فقط، المجتمع النسائي من المعارضة فقط، بينما تعاملتم مع النظام ككتلة واحدة. ما أعطى النظام نقطة قوة على حساب المعارضة. استغل النظام بشكل جيد في تعطيل كافة الحلول حتى هذه اللحظة وفي التقدم على الأرض عبر مسارات استدامة وغيرها. السؤال الثاني حول المقاربة حول الدستور. تقولون أن المقاربة حول الدستور هي حاليا أولوية بالنسبة لكم، ولكن ألا تتفق معي سعادة السفير أن الدستور هو نتيجة للحل السياسي وليس سابق للحل السياسي؟ نحن كسوريين ننتمي إلى تاريخ عريق من كتابة الدساتير. نحن كتبنا أول دستور عام 1918 وكان هذا الدستور نتيجة للمؤتمر السوري العام وكان بالانتخاب. لماذا تريدون فرض دستور علينا يكتبه الروس أو يكتبه الأمم المتحدة أو يكتبه من آخرون، ولا نكتبه نحن كسوريين كنتيجة للعملية السياسية وليس سابقا لها؟ شكرا لكم.
Of course there are Syrians. We are here in this hall. Hi, how are you? And we are everywhere. We are in camps. أنا اسمي كمال سليمان. أنا الفايس president of the negotiation committee. That's why I meet Mr. Ramzi Azzedine all the time. And I'm saying, yes, there are Syrians. They are everywhere. They are here in this hall. And they meet Mr. Azzedine and Mr. Dimstor all the time. They go to Russia. They go to America. They go to France. We are here, some of us based in Egypt. We have a very good cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt. We are Syrian, majority of us, we want transition in Syria, we want a democratic country. That's all. We want accountable governing. We want to live in a decent country. Since I am in the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, I have to tell you that in 1954, Damascus is the capital of Arabism. It's the capital of bourgeoisie in the Middle East. It's the oldest city living on earth, still living. And also it's the first capital of the Islamic Empire, the Sunni Islamic Empire. But in 1954, they elected to the parliament somebody who's not an Arab. He's Kurd, somebody who doesn't believe in the existence of God because he's a communist, Marxist. And somebody who doesn't believe in private property, he's a communist. Khalid Bigdash, the head of the Communist Party. That's my country. In my country in 1954, there were so many parties in the parliament. The Muslim Brotherhood will be fighting all the time to have a small minority in our parliament. So Syrians are there. We are cooperating, I think, Your Excellency, with the United Nations. We agreed on the 12th principle. We agree on the 2254. We don't agree on the slogan written everywhere in Damascus, right from the beginning in 2011. Al-Assad أو نحرق البلد. Al-Assad أو نحرق البلد. We don't agree on that. We believe Syria is bigger than Al-Assad, the regime, is bigger than the opposition, bigger than the Alawites, the Sunnis, the Kurds, the Arabs. Syria is Syria. And we want a stable, prosperous, democratic country. And that's what we fight for. Sorry about that, but I have just to clarify this point. Since I am here, I feel the duty to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haman. Ramzi, I'll give you the floor to answer the questions because there are 4 or 5 already, and I did promise you not to extend it too far. So I apologize to those who raised their hand, but we're going to have to call it an end after he finishes his responses.
Thank you, Nabil. I think it's a great way to end this encounter, getting questions and comments from 3 friends, actually. And that makes it very gratifying for me. Now, Anis, you said mistakes were committed. Everybody made mistakes in Syria. Syrians, and the government and opposition made mistakes. Regional powers made mistakes. International powers made mistakes. And the result is the tragedy you see. So and I think people are prepared to admit today that they have made mistakes. Maybe not publicly, but yes, mistakes have been made. But put that behind us. The issue is how to move ahead and deal with the situation. You raised an issue because an old UN hand, of course, the model of the special envoy and the role of the Secretary General. Well, in the 50s, the world was far less complicated than it is today. The agenda was far shorter, so it was possible for the Secretary General to engage personally in many of these conflicts. If you look at the situation today, you see a multitude of conflicts, each one with its own characteristics. The Secretary General, in addition to his role as the ultimate actor in conflict resolution, or the ultimate mediator, has many other issues that he has to deal with, economic, political, and social. So I think the model in itself, I think, has been tested. Maybe, as you say, it has not always produced results, but I don't see, quite frankly, an alternative, because the Secretary General personally is unable to intervene on a continuous basis in any of these conflicts. But he does. I mean, I can tell you, for example, on Syria, he was instrumental in making sure that Sochi fed into the UN process. I can tell you that. And I think here brings us to your other point or question. How does the UN feel with these multiple initiatives that I refer to, Sochi, Astana, and others, and so forth? Now, the UN on its own cannot operate in such a complex environment. If any country or group of countries feel that they want to help the UN, they're most welcome to do that, and we encourage that. Now, when the first initiative was Astana, and there was great concern that it would completely marginalize the UN. And the UN was counseled not to participate, not to attend, and leave Astana on its own. Our decision was no, we would go there as an observer to make sure that whatever happens in Astana will help us in Geneva. And this is exactly what happened. They were working on de-escalation zones where the UN has no mandate. I mean, I made it very clear in the beginning that there were two aspects to the problem. One was a ceasefire or de-escalation, and even the international community, as represented in the International Syria Support Group, decided this was the purview of the players, international and regional, not the UN. The UN had to do with the political process. So we made sure whatever happens in Astana remained on de-escalation zones. Nothing political was discussed there, and we would benefit from the efforts done in Astana. Sochi, the same thing. It was an attempt by the Russian Federation, with the support, as I said, of Iran and Turkey, to bring in as many Syrians as possible and to focus on the issue of the constitution. For us, it was one element, one basket of the four. Now, if we are able to progress on one, why not? Sochi has done that, and we picked it up, and now we are pursuing the creation of this committee. And as I said, and I will not hide it, there are difficulties because the government looks at things differently, and so we have to engage with them and make sure that they are on board in this project, which is sanctioned by the Security Council at this point. What is always clear is that there may be a few initiatives, call them mediation or whatever, but the central mediator is the United Nations, and I think countries understand that. In our engagement, for example, with the Russian Federation, they have always said very clearly that whatever they do, whether it's Astana or Sochi and so forth, is to help the special envoy discharge his mandate. So we're not disturbed. On the contrary, we are present. We were present in Sochi, we're present in Astana, always to make sure they feed into the Geneva process. It is complicated, but I think without the help of the regionals, and we're always discussing now, what is the role of the regional powers and international powers? They choose to do it this way, fine. We will work with them to make sure that they help us. حق ربنا الشعب السوري هو يعني they are the ones who have suffered the most, and we have to help them. We are not going to impose anything on them. And I agree, and I think I said it, Samah, a few times. The regional players and the major international players have a duty and obligation to help create conditions, help the UN to create a situation where the Syrians can exercise their right to determine their future. That is a clear-cut situation. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. Now, inter-regional relations between Russia and the United States, EU and Russia, whatever, this is something for these countries to work out. What we do is create a context to allow them to feed into the political process. We cannot impose anything on them. Like I said, my job as a mediator is, in spite of this very gloomy picture, is to discern this very thin line and to convince these players that it is in their interest not to allow the situation to deteriorate, but to grasp this thin line and to expand it and to cooperate to make sure that there is a settlement. And that's what we are doing. Now, I was asked the question about our efforts in engaging the Syrian civil society have been largely confined to Syrians in the diaspora, not in Damascus. Well, I have to tell you that when I go to Damascus, I engage Syrians, whether they are in political parties that are officially sanctioned or otherwise. I would like to do more, much more inside Syria, but circumstances don't allow that. So I don't think one can blame the UN for not trying. The UN has always tried and is prepared to do more. Issue of the Constitution, I know it's a very sensitive issue, and you've raised, and I agree with you. I mean, nobody is going to write a constitution for the Syrians. Nobody is going to impose a constitution on the Syrians. What we are doing at the UN is help Syrians create a context, create a mechanism, provide them with ideas, inputs, and so forth, so that they can, amongst themselves, in a mechanism that is to be determined, which is the committee today, to discuss this constitution. And they will, at the end of the day, draft the constitution, and it will be subject to a referendum by the Syrian people. Now, we can discuss the series of steps that need to be done, but I can assure you, nobody has the intention, certainly not the UN, to impose a constitution on the Syrian people. This is far, far from what we have in mind. I think I have covered all the questions that have been asked.
Thank you, Ramzi. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here this evening. Why don't you join me in thanking Ramzi for his presentation and answers his questions.